The aircraft carrier USS Franklin CV-13 was burning from stem to stern on the morning of March 19, 1945, after a single Japanese dive bomber had penetrated the ship's combat air patrol at dawn and dropped two 500-pound bombs that struck the flight deck just as the carrier's air group was being armed and fueled for strikes against Japanese airfields on Kyushu, detonating among dozens of fully loaded aircraft and igniting fires that consumed aviation gasoline and exploded ordnance in a cascading series of blasts that killed hundreds of sailors in the first minutes and threatened to destroy the 27,000-ton warship that had been commissioned less than 2 years earlier, and which now seems certain to become the largest American aircraft carrier lost during the entire Pacific War. The Franklin was operating 50 miles off the Japanese coast as part of Task Force 58, the fast carrier striking force that had been conducting continuous operations against targets throughout the Japanese home islands in preparation for the invasion of Okinawa. And the carrier's position so close to enemy territory meant that rescue operations would be complicated by the presence of Japanese aircraft and submarines that might attack the crippled vessel or the ships that came to her assistance, creating a tactical dilemma where the task force commander had to balance the desire to save the Franklin and her crew against the risk of losing additional ships in what might prove to be a futile rescue attempt if the fires could not be controlled, and the carrier had to be abandoned and scuttled to prevent her from falling into enemy hands. The attack had occurred at 0707 hours when a single Yokosuka D-45 Judy dive bomber emerged from low clouds that had provided concealment during the final approach to the American task force, and the Japanese pilot had selected the Franklin as his target, either through deliberate choice or simply because the carrier happened to be the first ship he encountered after breaking through the cloud layer. Diving from 5,000 feet and releasing his bombs from an altitude of approximately 1,000 feet before pulling up sharply and disappearing back into the clouds, while anti-aircraft gunners aboard the Franklin and her escorts were still training their weapons on the rapidly moving target that had appeared and attacked and vanished in less than 30 seconds. The first bomb struck the flight deck near the number 2 elevator, penetrating the wooden deck planking and exploding on the hangar deck among aircraft that were fully fueled and armed with bombs and rockets and machine gun ammunition, and the blast killed dozens of plane handlers and mechanics who had been working to prepare the aircraft for launch, while simultaneously igniting fires that spread instantly through the aviation gasoline that had been spilled when fuel lines were ruptured by the explosion. The second bomb struck the deck edge near the after elevator and penetrated 3 decks before exploding in a compartment that housed ready ammunition for the 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, detonating several tons of powder and projectiles in a blast that blew a 40-foot hole in the ship's side and sent fragments of steel plating and gun mounts flying hundreds of feet into the air, while the overpressure from the explosion rippled through adjacent compartments and killed or injured everyone within a 100-foot radius of the detonation point. The Franklin's commanding officer, Captain Leslie Gehres, a 50-year-old Naval Academy graduate who had commanded the carrier for only 3 months and who had been on the bridge when the bomb struck, immediately ordered damage control parties to begin fighting the fires, while simultaneously directing the ship's helmsman to turn into the wind to reduce the apparent wind speed across the flight deck and prevent the natural airflow from fanning the flames that were already spreading rapidly through the hangar deck and threatening to reach the magazines and fuel tanks that could cause catastrophic secondary explosions if the fires were not brought under control within minutes. The carrier was making 30 knots when the bombs hit, generating a relative wind of 30 knots across the deck that was driving the fires aft toward the island superstructure where the bridge and primary flight control spaces were located. And Gehres understood that if the fires reached these critical control stations, the ship would become unmanageable and would have to be abandoned, because there would be no way to coordinate damage control efforts or navigate the vessel without functioning command spaces. The helmsman executed the turn while fighting heavy vibration from the propulsion system that had been damaged when the bomb explosion near the stern had severed steam lines and disrupted the careful balance of thrust that was required to keep the massive carrier on course at high speed. And the ship swung through 90 degrees while listing 5 degrees to starboard from flooding that was occurring in compartments where the hull had been breached by the explosions and where damage control parties had not yet been able to establish pumping operations that would control the water ingress and prevent the list from increasing to angles that might compromise stability. The fires on the hangar deck were spreading with terrifying speed as aviation gasoline burned with intense heat that ignited the wooden crates containing ammunition and spare parts that were stowed throughout the hangar space. And the smoke from these fires was so thick that damage control parties could not see more than a few feet in any direction and had to navigate by touch while dragging fire hoses through spaces where the temperature exceeded 500 degrees Fahrenheit and where the deck plating was hot enough to blister unprotected skin on contact. The first explosion on the hangar deck had killed most of the damage control personnel who had been stationed in that area, leaving only a handful of survivors who attempted to fight fires that were already beyond the capacity of shipboard firefighting equipment to control. And these men retreated after several minutes when the heat became unbearable and when it became clear that without massive reinforcement from other damage control parties, there was no possibility of containing the fires before they consumed the entire hangar deck and spread to the flight deck above and the compartments below. The abandonment of the hangar deck meant that fires were now burning unchecked through approximately 40,000 square feet of space, containing dozens of fully armed aircraft and hundreds of tons of aviation ordnance, creating conditions where major explosions could occur at any moment, as bombs and rockets cooked off in the intense heat and detonated with force sufficient to blow holes in the armored hangar deck and cause progressive structural failure that might ultimately break the carrier's back and send her to the bottom in pieces. Captain Gehrys made the agonizing decision at 0730, 23 minutes after the initial attack, to order all non-essential personnel to abandon ship because the fires were clearly out of control and appeared likely to reach the forward magazines within minutes. And if those magazines exploded, the resulting detonation would obliterate everything forward of the island and would probably cause the ship to break in half and sink rapidly, with catastrophic loss of life. The order to abandon ship was passed by word of mouth because the ship's announcing system had been destroyed by the explosions and because telephone circuits had been severed throughout the forward part of the vessel, and sailors who received the order began moving toward the stern, where they could jump into the water and swim away from the burning carrier before the expected magazine explosion occurred. Hundreds of men went over the side during the next 30 minutes, jumping from the flight deck and the hangar deck openings, and the sponsons that projected from the ship's sides, falling 60 or 70 feet into water that was covered with a film of fuel oil that had leaked from the Franklin's ruptured tanks, and which created an additional hazard because men who swallowed the oil-contaminated water often became violently ill and were unable to swim effectively while waiting for rescue by the destroyers that were maneuvering alongside the carrier to pick up survivors. The destroyers USS Hunt and USS Marshall had closed to within 50 feet of the Franklin's starboard side, despite the obvious danger of being caught in secondary explosions if the carrier's magazines detonated, and these small ships were plucking survivors from the water while their crews watched enormous explosions continuing to erupt from the Franklin's hangar deck as ammunition cooked off and detonated in blasts that sent debris raining down on the destroyers and created splashes that drenched the rescue parties who were hauling exhausted and oil-soaked sailors aboard using cargo nets and Jacob's ladders and lines thrown from the destroyer's decks. The destroyer captains maintained their positions alongside the burning carrier for more than an hour, rescuing 832 men from the water, while their own ships were repeatedly struck by fragments from the explosions aboard the Franklin. And while Japanese aircraft continued to circle the task force, looking for opportunities to attack ships that were focused on rescue operations and therefore vulnerable to strikes by pilots who might have been deterred by the concentrated anti-aircraft fire that American ships normally put up when they had time to prepare for incoming attacks. The destroyers finally pulled away at 900 hours, when it appeared that most of the survivors who were going to be rescued had been picked up, and when the risk of remaining alongside the Franklin had become too great to justify further rescue attempts, and these ships then stood off at a distance of several miles, while their crews watched the carrier continue to burn and waited for the massive explosion that everyone expected would mark the Franklin's final moments. But the Franklin did not explode, and she did not sink. And over the next 4 hours, a combination of extraordinary courage and remarkable good fortune allowed damage control parties to gradually contain the fires and prevent them from reaching the magazines that held hundreds of tons of high explosives that would certainly have destroyed the ship if they had been reached by the flames that were still consuming the hangar deck and the spaces immediately adjacent to it. The critical factor in the Franklin's survival was the decision by Commander Joseph Taylor, the ship's damage control officer, to lead a small party of volunteers back into the smoke-filled spaces near the forward magazines and manually flood those magazines by opening valves that would allow seawater to pour in and submerge the ammunition before it could be heated to the point where it might detonate spontaneously from the extreme temperatures that were being generated by fires burning only one deck above the magazine spaces. Taylor and his men worked for more than 2 hours in darkness and smoke, so thick that they could not see their hands in front of their faces, navigating by memory and by touch to locate the flooding valves, whose positions they knew from countless damage control drills, but which were now nearly impossible to find in the chaotic conditions that prevailed throughout the forward part of the ship, where every passageway looked the same, and where the normal landmarks that would have guided them had been obliterated by the explosions and fires. The party succeeded in flooding the forward magazines, pouring thousands of tons of seawater into spaces that had been designed to remain absolutely dry, and which now became flooded compartments that contributed to the ship's stability problems, but which prevented the catastrophic explosion that would have destroyed the Franklin if the fires had reached the stored ammunition. The flooding of the magazines was accomplished at approximately 1100 hours, 4 hours after the initial attack, and by this time the fires on the hangar deck had begun to burn themselves out as the available fuel was consumed, and as the lack of oxygen in the smoke-filled spaces reduced the combustion rate to the point where the fires were no longer spreading aggressively through new areas, but were instead continuing to burn in isolated pockets where sufficient fuel and air remained to sustain combustion. Among the individual acts of heroism that occurred during these desperate hours was the action of Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald Gary, a 26-year-old officer from Flat Rock, Indiana, who had been serving as a communications officer when the attack occurred, and who voluntarily led multiple rescue parties into smoke-filled compartments below the hangar deck, where hundreds of men had been trapped when the explosions severed the normal escape routes and filled passageways with toxic smoke that killed anyone who remained in these spaces for more than a few minutes without breathing apparatus. Gary made 5 separate trips into the trapped spaces, each time crawling through passages where visibility was 0 and where temperatures exceeded 300 degrees Fahrenheit, feeling his way along bulkheads while dragging unconscious sailors toward exits and fresh air. And during these rescue operations, he pulled more than 300 men from spaces where they would certainly have died if Gary had not ignored direct orders from senior officers who told him that further rescue attempts were futile and that he was risking his own life for men who were probably already dead. Gary's actions earned him the Medal of Honor, but he later said that he had simply done what needed to be done, and that hundreds of other men aboard the Franklin had displayed equal courage during circumstances where every surviving sailor had been forced to make decisions about whether to save themselves or to remain aboard and fight for the ship, despite knowing that staying aboard might mean dying in the next explosion or the next fire that swept through compartments where damage control equipment had been destroyed and where normal firefighting procedures were impossible to execute. The role of the ship's chaplains during the crisis provided another dimension of the Franklin story that illustrated how leadership and moral authority could emerge from unexpected sources during moments of extreme danger when normal command structures had been disrupted, and when individual initiative became more important than formal rank or assigned duties. Commander Joseph O'Callaghan, a Jesuit priest who served as the Franklin's Catholic chaplain, moved continuously throughout the ship during the attack and its aftermath, administering last rites to dying sailors while simultaneously helping to organize firefighting efforts and providing encouragement to exhausted damage control parties who were on the verge of giving up after hours of fighting fires that seemed impossible to control. O'Callaghan, who was 43 years old and who had never received formal training in damage control or shipboard emergency procedures, learned by observation and common sense how to operate fire hoses and damage control equipment, and he worked alongside sailors who were less than half his age while showing a physical stamina and mental resilience that inspired men who had begun to believe that the Franklin could not be saved and that further efforts were pointless. O'Callaghan received the Medal of Honor for his actions, becoming one of only 3 chaplains to receive the nation's highest military decoration during World War II. And his citation specifically noted that he had courageously assisted in fighting fires, removing ammunition, and rescuing wounded while constantly exposed to enemy fire and extreme danger from explosions. The damage control situation remained critical because the Franklin had taken on thousands of tons of water from the flooded magazines and from firefighting operations and from flooding in damaged compartments below the waterline, creating a list that had increased to 13 degrees by noon, and which threatened to increase further if pumping operations could not remove water faster than it was entering the ship through the various holes and cracks and open seams that the explosions had created throughout the whole structure. The carrier's engineering spaces had been damaged by the explosions, and several boiler rooms had been abandoned when steam lines ruptured and filled the spaces with superheated steam that killed anyone who remained inside, leaving only 2 boilers operational out of the 8 that normally provided steam to the turbines that drove the Franklin's 4 propeller shafts. And this reduced power capability meant that the ship could make only 5 or 6 knots under her own power, which was barely sufficient for steerage and which left the carrier vulnerable to submarine attack, because she could not maneuver quickly enough to evade torpedoes if Japanese submarines detected the crippled vessel and moved in for attacks that might easily sink a ship that was already listing heavily and barely making headway. Captain Gares made the decision at 1200 hours to attempt to save the Franklin, rather than abandoning her and allowing the ship to be scuttled or to drift until she sank or ran aground on the Japanese coast only 50 miles away. And this decision required him to convince the task force commander, Rear Admiral Ralph Davison, that the carrier could be saved despite the terrible damage she had sustained, and despite the fact that she remained vulnerable to additional Japanese attacks while she limped away from the combat zone at speeds that were barely faster than a man could walk. Davison agreed to provide destroyer escorts and air cover, while the Franklin attempted to reach safer waters farther from the Japanese coast, and he also directed the heavy cruiser USS Pittsburgh to take the carrier under tow if the Franklin's own propulsion failed completely, or if her condition deteriorated to the point where she could no longer make headway under her own power. And this arrangement gave Geras the support he needed to attempt the unprecedented feat of saving a carrier that had suffered damage exceeding that sustained by any other American aircraft carrier that had survived to reach port rather than sinking shortly after being attacked. The Franklin's journey from the waters off Kyushu to the relative safety of Ulithi Atoll, a distance of approximately 1,500 nautical miles that would require 10 days of continuous steaming under the best conditions, and which actually required 14 days given the Franklin's reduced speed and the frequent stops that were necessary to conduct emergency repairs and to transfer injured personnel to other ships that had better medical facilities than the Franklin's damaged sickbay could provide, became an epic of damage control and seamanship that demonstrated both the incredible resilience of Essex-class carrier designs and the extraordinary determination of the officers and crew who refused to abandon their ship despite suffering casualties that ultimately totaled 724 dead and 265 wounded, making the Franklin's losses the heaviest sustained by any American warship that survived the war, and which exceeded the combined casualties of many ships that had been sunk during major fleet actions. The list of 14 degrees that the Franklin carried throughout most of the voyage created constant difficulties for damage control parties who were trying to move equipment and supplies through passageways that tilted at angles that made normal walking impossible, and which required sailors to pull themselves along using handrails and stanchions while carrying tools and hoses and pumps that weighed hundreds of pounds, and the continuing danger of additional explosions from ammunition that was still cooking off in isolated pockets throughout the hangar deck and the compartments below, meant that everyone aboard the Franklin was constantly aware that the ship might still be lost if fire reached one of the magazines that had not been flooded, or if a major structural failure occurred in areas where the hull had been weakened by the bomb explosions and subsequent fires. The Pittsburgh took the Franklin under tow on March 20th, the day after the attack, when it became clear that the carrier could not maintain sufficient speed to keep up with the task force that was withdrawing toward Ulithi after completing the scheduled strikes against Japanese targets. And the sight of the massive cruiser towing the even more massive carrier created one of the most memorable images of the Pacific War as photographers aboard escort vessels captured pictures showing the Franklin listing heavily with smoke still rising from her ravaged flight deck, while the Pittsburgh maintained a steady strain on the heavy steel towing cable that connected the two ships and which was rated for loads up to 300 tons, but which was being stressed to its absolute limit by the need to tow a vessel that displaced 27,000 tons and which presented enormous resistance to forward motion because of her damaged hull and flooded compartments that increased drag far beyond what a ship in normal condition would experience. The technical challenges involved in the towing operation were formidable because the Franklin's damaged condition meant that she was not behaving like a normal ship under tow, with her heavy list causing asymmetric water flow around the hull that created unpredictable side forces, which threatened to cause the carrier to yaw unpredictably and potentially part the towing cable if the Pittsburgh could not maintain steady tension while compensating for the Franklin's tendency to pull to one side or the other. The towing cable itself was a masterpiece of marine engineering, consisting of steel wire rope 3 inches in diameter and more than 1,500 feet long, with the length being necessary to allow the cable to stretch slightly under load and thereby absorb shock loads that might occur if the carrier surged forward relative to the Pittsburgh during moments when wave action or changes in wind pressure caused temporary changes in the relative speeds of the two vessels. The cable had been passed from the Pittsburgh to the Franklin, using a messenger line fired across the gap between the ships by a line-throwing gun. with the messenger line then being used to haul progressively heavier lines across until finally the massive towing cable could be pulled across and secured to the Franklin's anchor chain, which provided the strongest available attachment point on a ship whose normal towing fittings had been destroyed or rendered inaccessible by the damage and flooding throughout the forward part of the vessel. The strain on the towing cable during the initial stages of the tow was so great that both ships stationed damage control parties near the cable attachments with axes ready to cut the cable free if it appeared likely to part explosively, because a 3-inch steel cable under tension of several hundred tons contains enormous stored energy that is released instantaneously if the cable breaks, and the whipping action of a parted cable can cut a man in half or decapitate anyone unfortunate enough to be in the path of the recoiling cable ends that slash across the deck at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The Pittsburgh's crew had rigged heavy canvas screens around the cable path to provide some protection from a potential cable failure, and they had established safety zones where personnel were prohibited from standing unless absolutely necessary for towing operations. But everyone involved understood that if the cable parted during maximum strain conditions, there was no practical protection that would save someone who was caught in the wrong place when tons of steel wire rope suddenly released its tension and lashed across the deck with lethal force. The towing operation continued for 3 days until engineers aboard the Franklin succeeded in returning one additional boiler to service and generating enough steam to power 2 propeller shafts at low speed, giving the carrier sufficient propulsion to maintain 6 knots under her own power and allowing the Pittsburgh to cast off the tow and resume her normal duties as a screening vessel, protecting the other ships in the formation from submarine and air attack. The Franklin arrived at Ulithi on March 24th, 5 days after the attack, and she anchored in the lagoon while damage assessment teams came aboard to evaluate the extent of the structural damage and determine whether the carrier could be repaired at forward bases or whether she would need to transit all the way to Pearl Harbor or even to the West Coast for repairs that might take a year or longer, depending on the severity of the damage to critical systems and structural members. The medical situation aboard the Franklin during the 5 days between the attack and arrival at Ulithi had been desperate because the ship's main sickbay had been destroyed by the initial explosions and because most of the medical officers and corpsmen had been killed or wounded during the first minutes of the attack, leaving only a handful of medical personnel to treat hundreds of injured men who suffered from burns ranging from superficial first-degree injuries to deep third-degree burns that destroyed skin and muscle tissue, and which were extremely painful and highly susceptible to infection in the unsanitary conditions that prevailed throughout the damaged ship, where medical supplies were limited, and where proper sterilization of instruments and dressings was nearly impossible. The surviving medical personnel established emergency treatment stations in passageways and compartments that had not been damaged by the fires, working without adequate lighting or proper surgical equipment to stabilize the most severely injured patients, while making difficult triage decisions about which men could be saved with available resources and which were too badly injured to survive, despite any treatment that could be provided under the circumstances. The ship's senior surviving medical officer, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Sherman, a 34-year-old surgeon from Philadelphia, who had been blown off his feet by the initial explosion, but who had suffered only minor injuries himself, organized the medical response with remarkable efficiency considering the chaotic conditions and the absence of normal medical facilities, and he personally performed more than 40 emergency surgeries during the first 72 hours after the attack, including amputations and emergency thoracotomies and removal of embedded shrapnel from dozens of wounded sailors, who would certainly have died if Sherman had not been able to provide immediate surgical intervention. Despite working in spaces that were dimly lit and poorly ventilated, and completely lacking the sterile conditions that proper surgery required. The burns that many Franklin sailors suffered were particularly horrific because they had been caused by burning aviation gasoline that adhered to skin and clothing and continued burning until it was manually extinguished or until the fuel was completely consumed, creating injuries that extended through multiple layers of tissue and which left victims in agony that could only partially be relieved by the limited quantities of morphine that were available after the ship's main medical supply spaces had been destroyed in the initial explosions. Sherman and his medical team developed improvised burn treatments using materials that were available aboard ship, including petroleum jelly that was normally used for mechanical lubrication, but which could be applied to burn wounds to protect damaged tissue and reduce pain by preventing air from reaching exposed nerve endings. And they used clean cotton fabric torn from undamaged uniforms and bedding to create dressings that protected wounds from contamination, while allowing medical personnel to monitor healing progress and identify infections that required treatment with the limited quantities of sulfur drugs and penicillin that remained available after most of the ship's pharmaceutical supplies had been destroyed or rendered unusable by water damage from firefighting operations. The assessment teams discovered that the bomb explosions and subsequent fires had caused far more extensive damage than had been visible from external examination, with critical wiring and piping runs severed throughout the ship and with structural damage extending through multiple decks in areas where the intense heat from burning aviation gasoline had weakened steel beams and deck plating to the point where they might fail under stress and create progressive structural collapse that could break the ship's back if the Franklin attempted to steam at high speed or encountered heavy weather during the long voyage to a shipyard capable of conducting major repairs. The assessment concluded that the Franklin could not be repaired at Ulithi or at any forward base because the damage was too extensive and too complex to be addressed with the limited equipment and personnel available at locations that had been established primarily to conduct routine maintenance and emergency repairs rather than the fundamental reconstruction that the Franklin would require before she could return to combat operations. The decision was made to send the Franklin to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, a voyage of approximately 12,000 miles that would take the carrier across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor, then through the Panama Canal to the East Coast, and which would require approximately 6 weeks of steaming at reduced speed, with frequent stops to address mechanical problems and to pump out compartments that were continuing to flood despite the best efforts of damage control parties to locate and seal the leaks that were allowing water to enter the ship through cracks and holes that were often hidden behind equipment or buried within structural spaces that were nearly impossible to access without removing major components or cutting access holes in bulkheads and decks. The Franklin departed Ulithi on April 3rd, 2 weeks after the attack, and she made the transit to Pearl Harbor without encountering serious problems despite concerns that Japanese submarines might detect the slow-moving carrier and attempt torpedo attacks that could easily sink a ship that was already heavily damaged and barely seaworthy. And the Franklin's arrival at Pearl Harbor on April the 13th marked the completion of the first leg of a journey that would ultimately cover more than 15,000 miles and which would demonstrate that even catastrophically damaged carriers could be saved if crews were willing to fight for their ships with the kind of determination and skill that the Franklin survivors had shown during the darkest hours after the attack, when it had seemed certain that the carrier would be lost. The Franklin remained at Pearl Harbor for 3 weeks, while shipyard workers conducted emergency repairs that included temporary patching of the worst hull damage and replacement of critical equipment that had been destroyed by the fires. And during this period, the carrier's crew was largely replaced with a fresh complement of officers and sailors who would take the ship to New York, because most of the men who had been aboard during the attack were either dead or wounded, or so physically and psychologically exhausted from their ordeal that they were not fit for extended sea duty and needed to be sent back to the United States for rest and recuperation before they could be reassigned to other ships. The departure of the original crew created a strange situation where the Franklin sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 4th with fewer than 100 men aboard who had actually been present during the attack. And these survivors found themselves surrounded by new personnel who had heard about the Franklin's ordeal but who had not experienced it, and who could not fully understand the psychological trauma that lingered in men who had watched their friends die in terrible ways and who had faced death themselves while fighting fires and explosions that had seemed certain to destroy the ship and kill everyone aboard. The voyage from Pearl Harbor to the Panama Canal required 2 weeks of uneventful steaming through calm seas that allowed the Franklin to maintain speeds of 12 to 15 knots without experiencing significant mechanical problems, and the carrier transited the canal on May 20th, after waiting several days for a suitable tidal window, because the Franklin's reduced freeboard from the flooding and list made her more vulnerable to grounding. If water levels in the canal locks were not carefully controlled during the transit. The passage through the canal attracted enormous attention from workers and military personnel who lined the locks to watch the damaged carrier pass through, and newspaper photographers captured dramatic images of the Franklin's scorched and twisted flight deck that showed the terrible power of the explosions that had nearly destroyed the ship and which had killed so many of her crew during those first terrible minutes after the Japanese bombs struck. The Franklin arrived at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on May 28th, 70 days after the attack, and she entered dry dock immediately so that workers could begin the massive reconstruction that would be required to return the carrier to operational condition. And the initial assessment determined that repairs would require at least 18 months and would cost approximately $50 million, which was nearly half the original construction cost of the ship, and which raised questions about whether it made economic sense to repair the Franklin, or whether the Navy should simply scrap the damaged hull and use the resources to build a new carrier that would incorporate the latest design improvements, and which would not carry the psychological burden of being a ship where more than 700 men had died in circumstances that had traumatized the survivors and created a reputation that might make it difficult to recruit crews willing to serve aboard a vessel that many sailors considered unlucky or cursed. The Navy ultimately decided to proceed with repairs because the Franklin's hull and engineering plant were fundamentally sound despite the severe damage to upper decks and superstructure, and because scrapping the carrier would have sent a demoralizing message suggesting that American ships could be destroyed by single bomb hits if those hits occurred at particularly vulnerable moments when the ships were most exposed to catastrophic secondary damage from their own weapons and fuel. The reconstruction of the Franklin occupied the Brooklyn Navy Yard for more than 2 years as workers gradually replaced or repaired virtually every system aboard the carrier, installing new flight deck plating and new elevators and new catapults, while simultaneously rebuilding the hangar deck and replacing thousands of feet of electrical cable and piping that had been destroyed by the fires. And the work proceeded slowly, because wartime urgency had ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945, and because budget constraints in the post-war period meant that resources were limited and priorities were constantly shifting as the Navy adjusted to peacetime conditions and began the difficult process of demobilizing millions of sailors, while simultaneously maintaining a fleet large enough to meet America's new commitments as a global superpower facing potential conflict with the Soviet Union. The Franklin was finally recommissioned in February 1947, nearly 2 years after arriving at Brooklyn, but she served only briefly before being decommissioned again in February 1947. After Navy planners concluded that the rapid development of jet aircraft and guided missiles was making conventional carriers obsolete, and that resources should be directed toward building new ships designed specifically for jet operations rather than maintaining older carriers like the Franklin that had been designed for propeller-driven aircraft and which would require extensive modifications to handle the heavier and faster jets that were entering service. The Franklin remained in reserve status for more than 20 years, anchored with other inactive ships in the Bayonne Naval Annex, where she slowly deteriorated from lack of maintenance and from the corrosive effects of the marine environment that gradually weakened her structure and degraded her equipment, to the point where returning her to service would have required repairs nearly as extensive as those conducted after the 1945 attack. And in 1966, the Navy finally decided to scrap the Franklin, after concluding that she had no future value and that the cost of maintaining her in reserve exceeded any potential benefit that might be gained from keeping her available for reactivation in a national emergency. The carrier was towed to a shipbreaker's yard in New Jersey and was gradually cut apart over the course of several months, ending the story of a ship that had survived the most devastating single attack on any American aircraft carrier during World War II and which had demonstrated both the incredible damage tolerance of Essex-class carrier designs and the extraordinary courage and determination of the officers and crew who had refused to abandon their ship despite suffering losses that exceeded those of many vessels that had been sunk during major fleet battles. The story of the Franklin's survival became one of the most celebrated episodes of the Pacific War, and Captain Gares and Commander Taylor both received the Navy Cross for their leadership during the crisis, while more than 20 other officers and enlisted men received decorations including several medals of honor that recognized acts of heroism that had occurred during the most desperate hours when the ship's survival had depended on individuals who had voluntarily entered burning spaces or had remained at their posts despite terrible danger in order to perform duties that were essential to fighting fires and preventing explosions and maintaining the ship's watertight integrity. The Franklin's survival also influenced post-war carrier design as Navy architects studied the damage patterns and identified vulnerabilities that could be addressed through improved compartmentation and better protection for critical systems, including aviation fuel tanks and magazines that had proven vulnerable to fires and explosions when bombs struck at moments when aircraft were being armed and fueled on the hangar deck. And these design improvements were incorporated into the Forrestal-class supercarriers that entered service in the 1950s, and which represented a new generation of aircraft carriers that were larger and more capable than the Essex-class ships, but which also incorporated lessons about damage control and survivability that had been learned at terrible cost aboard ships like the Franklin. The human dimension of the Franklin disaster extended far beyond the immediate casualties, because the ship's survivors carried psychological scars that lasted for decades and which affected their ability to resume normal lives after returning home from the war. And many Franklin veterans reported experiencing nightmares and anxiety and difficulty maintaining relationships with family members who could not understand what they had experienced and who sometimes dismissed their continuing distress as weakness or inability to move forward from events that had occurred years or decades in the past. The Franklin Veterans Association, established in 1946, provided a support network for survivors who found that they could only discuss their experiences with other men who had been aboard the carrier during the attack and who understood viscerally what it had been like to fight fires while watching friends die and while facing the constant possibility that the ship would explode at any moment and kill everyone who remained aboard. And the association's annual reunions became important events where aging veterans could share memories and provide mutual support while honoring the shipmates who had not survived to grow old and enjoy the peace that their sacrifices had helped to secure. The Franklin story also raised difficult questions about command responsibility and about the decisions that Captain Gares had made during and after the attack, because some survivors believed that Gares had ordered abandoned ship prematurely, and had contributed to the high casualty toll by failing to maintain better control over the crew during the crisis, when hundreds of men had gone over the side and had been forced to swim in oil-contaminated water while waiting for rescue by destroyers that were overwhelmed by the number of survivors requiring assistance. These criticisms led to an informal investigation after the war, during which Navy officials reviewed Garris's actions and concluded that he had made reasonable decisions given the information available to him at the time and given the unprecedented nature of the damage that the Franklin had sustained. And this finding effectively ended official discussion of the controversy, although some survivors continued to maintain that different decisions might have saved lives and might have prevented some of the chaos that had characterized the first hours after the attack, when communication throughout the ship had been nearly impossible, and when individual sailors had been forced to make life or death decisions without clear guidance from officers who were themselves struggling to understand the extent of the damage and the likelihood that the ship could be saved. The legacy of the USS Franklin extends beyond her individual story to encompass broader questions about the vulnerability of aircraft carriers to catastrophic damage and about the trade-offs between offensive capability and defensive protection that have characterized carrier design throughout the jet age, because the Franklin's survival demonstrated that carriers could absorb enormous punishment if their damage control organizations functioned effectively. But her near loss also showed that single, well-placed hits could threaten to destroy even the largest warships if those hits occurred at moments when the ships were maximally vulnerable to secondary damage from their own weapons and fuel. Modern carrier designs incorporate numerous features intended to reduce this vulnerability, including improved fire suppression systems and better compartmentation, and stronger deck armor that can resist bomb penetration. But the fundamental tension between the need to carry large quantities of fuel and ammunition to support air operations and the desire to minimize the catastrophic damage that can result if these stored materials are ignited by enemy action remains a central challenge in carrier design that continues to influence naval architecture and tactical doctrine in ways that can be traced directly back to lessons learned aboard the Franklin during those desperate hours on March 19, 1945, when the carrier's survival hung in the balance and when individual acts of courage and determination made the difference between life and death for more than 2,000 men who had enlisted to serve their country and who found themselves facing a test of character and endurance that few human beings are ever called upon to endure, and which fewer still have the strength and courage to overcome successfully.